the policies have really encouraged and rewarded getting larger. So you have what were many small to mid-sized farms, now one large farm. It may have been 400 or 500 acre farms that are now 2,000 acre farm. You can have large swaths of the Midwest where a spray company will come through, spray the crop once, maybe come back and spray it twice, a second time, where that's done over large swaths of land to 1 or 2 crops, where in the past there may have been 5 crops in that same growing region. So things have been simplified greatly in my lifetime as a research and person looking at these things.
Welcome to the Real Organic Podcast. I'm Linley Dixon, co-director of the Real Organic Project. We're a grassroots, farmer-led movement with an add-on organic food label to distinguish organic crops grown in healthy soils and organic livestock raised on well-managed pasture. You just heard from Dr. Dave Mortensen, former National Organic Standards Board member and the head of the Agriculture, Nutrition, and Food Systems Department at the University of New Hampshire. Dr. Mortensen was there when we were debating whether or not soil should be part of organic systems. He speaks about how policy impacts our food system in lasting ways in this interview, including examples of where we've gone wrong. But he also shares a lot about his own research findings throughout his career, pointing to specific ways that we can shift our agricultural practices for the better.
Welcome to the Real Organic Podcast, and I'm talking today with Dave Mortensen. Dave, thank you for coming to visit me. It's wonderful, and I'll show you the greenhouse when we're done. I met Dave through his work on the National Organic Standards Board. He is the head of the Agriculture Department at University of New Hampshire, and when I met you, you were at Penn State. And we've had a lot of conversations actually about organic, what does organic mean and all that. But could you, I give short introductions, I let you do the work. So could you tell people a little bit about what you do, what your field of research is in?
Sure. I consider myself an agroecologist with a pretty deep understanding of organic agriculture, as well as pest ecology. Those are some of the fields that I've spent the better part of the 35 or 40 years of my academic life studying. Right now, I do a fair amount of writing and work with the next generation of agroecologists at a University of New Hampshire. That our department is an unusual one in that it spans a very broad slice of the food system. The actual name of the department is Agriculture, Nutrition, and Food Systems. This is much more integrative and a much more complete continuum from farm to fork to human wellness than any other land-grant department I've been a part of. I was at Penn State for 17 years, and before that on a faculty at the University of Nebraska for 14 years. So when I say I do research in agroecology, folks might wonder what does that look like? And some of the sorts of things that I've been involved with is a deep dive on the multifunctional benefits of cover crops, for example. A significant part of mine and many agroecologists' approach is participatory research with farmers on their farms. So we would conduct some work in a more controlled environment, but much of the work would be done on an actual farmer's place, or 5 or 15 farmers' places, where we're interested in how certain practices perform and gaining an understanding of the importance of context, the context of the individual farm, the legacy of the individual fields, the cultural practices that a farmer employs, etc., all come together to mediate how these sustainable regenerative practices unfold on an individual farm. So that's the sort of thing I've been up to.
So if I'm understanding right, you're talking about studying systems instead of one component of a system. That you're trying to see the interaction between all of these practices and the reality, the world in which they're taking place.
Certainly, yeah, certainly. Early on, so I started my research work in the late 70s and early 80s. And when I first entered the field, I would say that there was a lot more what some folks would refer to as flashlight science, or science that focuses on single factor effects on how a plant responds or how a soil responds. But increasingly, and certainly I would say the last 15 or 20 years of my work, as soon as you go on farm, you realize that single factor research has little bearing on how that single factor functions in the context of a much more complex system. In fact, you can poorly understand how even the single factor functions when it's taken out of the context of a farming system. So certainly the work is done where you're thinking about, the insect pests, you're thinking about the spatial proximity of one thing to another, you're thinking about how it is that things that were done 5 or 10 years ago in a field influence the legacy of those soils going forward. All of that comes together to shape how this multifunctional ecosystem service focused approach, how it is that plays out on an individual field and farm.
I got to talk to Stuart Hill a few years ago. Did you ever meet Stu?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. He was a great pioneer, really one of the very first academics to cross over and start paying serious attention to the organic movement. Mm-hmm. And he was an early speaker at the NOFA conferences. And I love, he was a strong scientist, but he often was talking about things like, the role of gender in organic farming. Mm. He would give workshops on men and farming, and all the attendees, he said, would be women trying to figure out how to deal with these crazy guys that were,
interesting.
Out of control in their lives. And, but and he works in very similar stuff to what you're doing, but with more of an emphasis on kind of the social aspect of our work. Mm-hmm. I'm curious. You use the term agroecology, and in America, that term is very seldom used outside of academia. I got to interview Miguel Altieri for this series also, and you've probably met Miguel, and he does just tremendous work with that. Well, how would you say agroecology is different from, say, real organic?
In many ways, I actually see them being one and the same. I mean, basically, an agroecological approach is an approach in which you're letting, or not letting, the underlying ecological principles that drive the processes of plant and animal growth and fitness and wellness, the health of the soil, those ecological processes inform our understanding, and then we're disturbing an ecological system by adding plants to the soil at a certain time, or having animals out on a pasture at a certain time, and having some impact on that pasture. The understanding of how the ecology is governing and driving the performance, the behavior of those organisms is something that then is deeply embedded in the management that results of producing a crop or managing a livestock operation in a way that is sustainable and in a way that is actually enhancing the environment in which those practices are being performed.
What you're describing, when I talked to Stu Hill, he said, we were talking about deep organic and shallow organic, and shallow organic has now become so shallow that there's almost no water left. It's on the sandbar there. But we were talking about deep science and shallow science in reference to that. You called it flashlight science. I like that. I'd never heard that before. So deep science was, as I understood, Stu was trying to study things in the context in which they actually exist, as opposed to isolating one thing. As he said, shallow science is giving a mouse a shot and seeing what happens next. As opposed to, seeing what happens with a mouse with maybe a particular diet in a particular environment, and do they thrive or not. And I think shallow science is very tempting because you feel like you can get very clear answers, except it strikes me that often they're wrong answers. False, not limited, very limited. They work when you isolate them from everything else.
That's right. That's right. And the way that I think about the shallowness of single factor or flashlight science, or shallow science in your words, Dave, is that we have very little ability to infer beyond the limits of this system in which we had placed that organism and did these very controlled manipulations, right? I actually was trained to be a good controlled manipulator early on, when I was very early in my work, with some systems science for sure, because actually it was interesting. I was going back and preparing and thinking about coming to visit you, Dave. I was expecting some questions about some of my background, and one of the first papers, actually it's the second paper that I was involved with that we published in Ecology, so this is an ecology journal, is entitled Arctic Tundra, a source or sink for atmospheric carbon dioxide in a changing environment, 1982.
1982.
So that was work we started in late 1978, 1979, and I would drive up to Alaska from Durham, North Carolina with another person in a Ford 150 pickup truck loaded with equipment, and then we would be flown off to our study site, dropped off for the entire spring thaw, summer season, and then picked up at the end of the season, where we were measuring the impacts of temperature manipulations on carbon dioxide efflux from a permafrosted, series of study sites that we were working in. But I'm sort of going off on a tangent here. If we do these factor experiments and we have very little ability to infer beyond the bounds of the experiment, then we basically don't understand the behavior of what we've been studying outside of this very controlled and often fairly contrived set of experimental treatments. A good example of this in farming that where we almost were laughing at ourselves when we realized just how important context was a group of researchers, myself included, were working with a group of farmers. And the farmer group were the body of an advisory board that advised on how we should do the research together The farmers were going to conduct the research. We were going to conduct the research, and we were going to do it together. And we were interested specifically in how certain mixtures of cover crops would perform, with the thought that with deep understanding about this mixture and this mixture and this mixture, we would be able to make a recommendation that this mixture is particularly good, or that one's particularly good, for growing. This was some work I was involved with in Pennsylvania. And fascinatingly, with the farmer's guidance, we took a subset of these mixtures and planted them out on a bunch of farmers' farms that were participating. So they were the scientists at their farm site, and we would go around and make measurements of the performance of these mixtures. And amazingly, what we found was that 3 or 4 years of detailed studies, they were system studies, but still pretty narrowly focused studies, at the research station at the university farm in Pennsylvania, up in the Appalachian Mountains, revealed that there were certain of these mixtures that were performing fairly consistently better than others. But what was fascinating was that when we went to look at the farmer data sets with the farmers, and then the farmers would present their own data back, we would fiddle with the data a little bit, and then they would present it back and interpret what was found, was that the mixture's performance was highly farm and field dependent. And when you think of, so in other words, the winners in the mixture and the losers in the mixture, that is by virtue of the amount of biomass they produced, or their success and their survival in the mixture, varied a great deal. And the best thing that predicted the performance was indigenous knowledge of the farmer about what had gone on in that field or in those fields on their farm. That was a much better predictor of who would win and who would lose in the cover crop mix than was some other set of factors that we might have gone into it thinking, would describe what was going on. So for example, if a farmer knew that they had planted a crop and that crop had ample nitrogen the year before, but the crop was subjected to a drought stress and yield was low and residual N was high, certain cover crops that scrubbed nitrogen from soils thrived, and those that fixed nitrogen did much less well in those fields than when we went to another place where that farmer knew that, N has been consistently deficient in the field. They were concerned about that. The legumes thrived, and the nitrogen scrubbers did much less well. So it was the case that the field was telling the cover crop mixture who the winners and losers were. And usually the farmer had a very good understanding of what the field might tell the cover crop mix.
Yeah.
So isn't that fascinating, just as an example?
Well, it is fascinating, David. And, it's fascinating because, for some years I've struggled to trust the results of scientific studies, especially comparing organic to conventional agriculture, because I felt that, well, if the people designing the study didn't understand organic, they probably weren't capable of creating a study that was meaningful to me. Yeah. And it's not personal. It's interesting. We were discussing Merchants of Doubt, Naomi Oreskes' book, and one of the things that book describes is they got some extremely prominent and prestigious scientists to defend tobacco and to defend the Star Wars initiative, Reagan's Star Wars initiative. And they were a tiny minority of the scientific community, but nonetheless, because of their prominence, they basically set back change in these things by a generation. And we see that science can be quite political, even though we would wish that it wasn't, but who gets funding and what gets promoted and all of that. I'm very encouraged to see the work that you're doing. I'm guessing that when you started, there wasn't a lot of that work being done relative to the work that would support the Bayer Monsantos of the world.
Yeah, there wasn't a lot of it being done, and I actually will admit that I wasn't doing that work at the very beginning. I came to it. I would say thanks to the handful of colleagues that you cross paths with, both farmers and researchers, that have a deeper understanding of the importance of taking a systems approach to regenerative agriculture. If it's not taken that way, right, you could easily be trained as a expert specialist in the brown marmorated stink bug or the invasive perennial weeds, and the risk of that is that you then almost can fall into the trap of looking for questions that are relevant to the brown marmorated stink bug or to perennial weed management in an agricultural setting. What's the risk of that? I actually saw the risk of that unfold in the Midwest when I was working in Nebraska for 14 years. When weed problems and the solution to weed problems was coming up with crops where you could spray these herbicides that would kill most any plant in the field, including the crop. And so the companies decided, well, we could manipulate the crop genome so that only the crop isn't killed, but everything else is killed by it. So that was sort of the lead up to Roundup Ready crops. And so I sort of was very concerned about this as it was unfolding, but for a weed science person, they would say, gosh, this is fascinating. We're going to be able to control the weeds and we're going to be able to control the perennial weeds. There's the danger then is that no one is asking the question, what might happen then if we start using this chemical on most of the fields? Well, actually, and that is exactly what is happening, and it actually has been happening for a while, and predictably, resistance is widespread. Additional herbicides are being used along with the Roundup to kill the weeds. So you have this single or very limited set of factors that puts the blinders on that you're going to be looking at weed control in a crop. And all of a sudden, like it's rather shocking and dismaying. We have a system now where the crop has been selected along with all these herbicide inputs that are being used. And we just finished a paper where we're documenting with the most recent USDA field pesticide use that this crop herbicide combination just in the last 10 years since an important paper we published in 2012 begging that we not go forward with this kind of an approach. Herbicide use has increased 70% in soybean, and this really nasty herbicide that is problematic certainly for organic growers because it drifts everywhere outside of the fields has increased 16-fold over the last 10 years, all on the backs of what we were just discussing, Dave, which is the danger of a very narrow approach where you're not seeing outside of the system, you're not seeing, what are all of the other things that come along with this narrow focus in the science that someone might be doing.
Yeah, what you just said almost made me cry, honestly.
Yeah.
The the accumulated losses keep piling up, and as you know, I quote him a lot, but poor Michael. But I asked Michael Pollan, are things getting better? Are things getting worse since you wrote Omnivore's Dilemma? And he said the public awareness is much better. There's much greater, you know, care and concern and people educating themselves. But the actual food system is getting worse and worse. The actual agriculture system, how the food is growing, is becoming more and more industrial and chemical. And what you're talking about there is that dicamba that is the growing product.
Yeah.
So what, just to help people who maybe, you know, are new to this conversation, what would be the issues of spraying an herbicide on a crop or on the ground? Why would anybody care that this is becoming so widespread and only kind of snowballing in its usage?
Yeah, well, there are a number of things to be concerned about, for sure. So when I came in with a cohort of folks that were coming out of labs like Miguel Altieri's lab, Matt Liebman, Nick Jordan at the University of Minnesota, myself, folks around the country. There was this cadre of young scientists at the time that were very committed, and the research programs that USDA ran spoke to the issue of preserving farms in the middle and reducing pesticide use in agriculture as important goals. This is back in the late 80s, early 1990s. Matt Liebman and I were Zooming together a couple of months ago and lamenting that that goal seems to have, at least at the federal level, has, you know, I mean, you don't see that in the calls for proposals now, like we saw them early on. And in fact, large conventional commodity crop production is going in the opposite direction, which is increased reliance on pesticide use in those crops. And you could debate, maybe some might argue that you could debate this, but there really is no debate. We called attention to this. I did and my colleagues in 2009 in a International Integrated Pest Management Symposium, that we really had to stop with this packaging of pesticides and crop traits and this increased industrialization of agriculture. And honestly, at this point, I would say it went largely unheeded. I had people placate me by saying, oh gosh, Dave, those papers you guys wrote were so important that helped inform the debate. But in fact, actually, the debate, while it unfolded, the policy decisions that were made by the USDA and the Environmental Protection Agency were ones that really gave the green light for this to unfold. So I continue to hold out hope that we will come to our senses on with this large commodity crop production that is in the way it's going. But it is not on a good trajectory right now. I mean, you know, the pesticide use intensity in soybeans has increased a great deal since I started. And just, we published this paper in 2012 that was considered, at least in conventional agriculture circles, to be quite this radical paper. It was called We Were at a Critical Juncture, and that was the title of the paper. And we begged for an agroecological approach, and there was a lot of meetings, congressional testimony, et cetera, that I participated in, congressional office visits for several years. really trying to move the needle on the policy decisions. But really what happened was the USDA and the Environmental Protection Agency went ahead and approved pretty much everything that we were arguing that we needed to be really thoughtful about taking those next steps and not do those approvals. Approval of dicamba, approval of the use of the genes, approval of different formulations of these pesticides, these herbicide pesticides that are being used. And so I think that it is, honestly, if conventional agriculture doesn't really lean into the ecological benefits that have been observed in organic agriculture to address the same pest problems, interestingly, in a completely different way, it's worrying where that's going to end up, to me.
So much there, David. So could you, that last sentence, you were saying that organic has addressed. Could you talk about what that means? First, I just want to say one thing for people who are listening. When you say pesticides, that includes herbicides. I mean, that pesticides is an umbrella term for insecticides, herbicides, and fungicides.
Yes.
Would you say the lion's share of the increase has been in herbicides?
Yeah. So yes. So has the increase been the biggest increase? And when I think about the changes that occur, I have a tendency to think about trying to keep them in proportion. Herbicides in the early 90s accounted for 75% of all of the pesticides used in the commodity crops. So that's, as you say, insecticides, herbicides, fungicides. So it was the big player. That was in 1990, 1986, 1995, in that area. And so when we say that in a commodity crop since 2012, that herbicide use increased 70%, we're saying that herbicide use increased 70% and it had already been the pesticide type in soybean that accounted for 75-80% of the pesticides. So when I say 70% of the large quantity of pesticides that were being used in 2012, that makes it all the more worrying to me that that's the trend. We've gone in the same period of time over the last 20 years or so, 15 to 20 years, we've gone to pesticide treatment of the seeds. Pretty much all of the conventional seeds that are planted are carrying of the commodity crops now, soybean, corn, are treated with an insecticide and a fungicide. Effectively, what that means is that all of the acres of commodity crops, 80 million acres of soy, 80 million plus acres of corn that are planted are treated with insecticide and fungicide. Now, back in the 80s, that might have been sprayed on the whole field or band applied, but actually, when I started, corn that was being rotated with soybeans in the Midwest, only about 35% or so that got an insecticide. Now, all of the corn that's planted is getting an insecticide because that's how the seed comes now. It's very difficult to buy conventional commodity crop seed that's not treated. So that's all, to me, the way I think of that is all part of the package, either on the seed or in the genome of the seed in the case of a herbicide resistance trait. And then you're buying the herbicide as part of the whole deal. And that's how it goes.
Yeah. So again, just to kind of help people a little bit, why should they care about all that herbicide? Because I think they should, but Could you explain to somebody why they might be concerned about this massive increase?
Yes. Yeah, thank you. I kind of didn't answer the question the first time around.
That's all right. That's a good answer.
Yeah, so why be concerned? A number of reasons to be concerned. First, farmers and field workers' exposure to synthetic pesticides increases when we use more pesticides. Residues of pesticides increase on food when we use more pesticides. For example, glyphosate residues on a number of the commodity crops have increased significantly, and we've adjusted the residue levels that are acceptable on the crops over that same period of time so that the threshold is not being exceeded on a regular basis. We also know from the U.S. Geological Survey samples water across the landscape of Vermont, here, New Hampshire, and all across the United States in 2,200 places minimum, where they have annual monitoring particularly for pesticide residues, but also for phosphorus, nitrogen, and other fertilizers that are being applied in agriculture. And as the area treated and amount applied at the landscape level increases, there's a functional relationship with an increasing presence. The likelihood of pesticides being in the water increases proportionate with the amount and area treated in a local landscape. So Dave, you were telling me this is the Connecticut River Valley. If farmers in the Connecticut River Valley were to increase the amount of herbicides that they're using on corn here, there is a predictable relationship between that increase and the amount that you would find in the Connecticut River or in the tributaries running into the river, with very high pulses in the spring. So the period of time shortly after the application, but then that persists for some period of time into the early summer, where because the fact is that the herbicide doesn't stay in the fields where it's applied. It's not desirable. It's not that the farmer intends for it to be in the Connecticut River, but when you have rains that result in runoff from the fields, it's carrying soil particles and it's carrying herbicide and insecticide that had been applied to the corn into the river. The same is true for herbicides like dicamba that we talked about earlier, where we've increased the reliance on this herbicide. It's an old herbicide. Older herbicides tended to have been developed in a time when there were fewer environmental and human subject exposure experiments and thresholds to cross. So it's an old herbicide that kills weeds. It's also notorious for not staying where it's applied. It moves not necessarily so much in the water, but it moves in the air through vapor drift. And so you could apply to a field 2 fields over, and that herbicide could very easily wind up in your field in another farmstead. And the downside of it is that it kills most broadleaf plants. So if you've grown, and certain of our broadleaf crop plants in certain families, like the Solanaceae, tomatoes, eggplants, peppers, are particularly sensitive to this herbicide that is now being applied widely to soybean that's been genetically modified to be unaffected by dicamba. And and it's being used widely now. So as you increase the amount and the area treated, the probability that it winds up somewhere else increases, because there's more of it either in the aerial atmosphere or there's more of it in the water, and it's more likely that you're going to find it in places that you don't want it. Those are probably, for me, the biggest reasons why. But you're also concerned about this heavy pesticide load on the soil microbiome. We actually know very little. We know a little bit, but we don't near understand the effects of that kind of cocktail of compounds being applied to the soil. They're basically in the soil matrix water complex, which is where all the microorganisms are. And they're known to have effects, adverse effects on those microorganisms in the microbiome of the soil. So that's not something that you want to be depressing through the use of those compounds either.
Yeah. So much that we actually don't understand.
Yeah.
I mean, we understand it enough to know it's not a good idea, but we really don't. Those unintended consequences are so difficult. Somebody from the European Parliament told me that we're all peeing glyphosate now. I had not actually heard that, but I guess it's so ubiquitous that it's in all our bodies. That there are no safe places to live anymore. Like, I live a clean life, I only eat organic food, and even so, that's part of my life now. It's part of my body.
Yeah, it's certainly our individual actions help a lot, help a whole lot. The choices that we make help a whole lot. But it is the case that we don't live in a world where when we see this as a system, there really aren't boundaries that things don't transcend. So they do wind up in the Connecticut River, unfortunately. It's farmer stewardship. It's all of us coming along together to understand the impacts of these choices we're making at the farm level and at the co-op level where we're selling these things, at the land grant level where we promote or at least recommend certain things. We are not seeing the full system level effects of these in our actions. That's for sure.
Fairly recently, a year or two ago, the EU Parliament passed an initiative called the Farm to Fork Initiative, and it was a big deal. It remains to be seen whether they will be able to meet their goals, but their goals were within 10 years to get to 25% of the land of agricultural land in the EU to be certified as organic, and to reduce their use of pesticides by 50%. It's a remarkably ambitious initiative, and they might or might not get it. But the very fact that they were trying, that this became an initiative passed by the European Parliament, and actually being exported to the rest of the world as part of their effort. And there are other things, a lot of things about worker welfare tied in there, but just those two very ambitious goals are, to me, pretty stupendous and appropriate, and how wonderful. And at the same time, I've seen the reaction from the USDA is one of total opposition, not just opposition, outrage, but they would even suggest that we should be increasing the organic acreage and reducing the use of chemicals in our agriculture. Have you heard about that? Is that something that you're aware of?
Yes, I'm very aware of that initiative. I've had the good fortune over the years of spending time in the Netherlands and in Denmark with colleagues at some research institutes there, and I have been invited actually more times to Europe, to The Hague, than to DC to talk about the GM, how the GM crop pesticide reality has unfolded in the States, because as you probably know, David, something largely genetically modified crops are not planted In certainly the mid and north of Europe, they're not allowed to be planted. There's sections of some of the southern European countries that have limited adoption of maize that is modified. So they're very concerned about the potential commercialization of these crops there because they see they have been bred to use pesticides. I mean, that's the whole purpose of them. Certainly for the weed part of it, it is, without any question. And so there's great resistance for a variety of reasons, but one of them is that they see it as a farming practice that goes hand in hand with an increased reliance on pesticide use in agriculture. So it's antithetical to this initiative that the EU is following to try to reduce the environmental impact of ag.
David, a question. Would you say that the genetic modification of the cultivars is what has led to this massive increase in the use of herbicides?
Yes.
That wouldn't have happened without that genetic modification.
Yes.
That's why that was such a hot political issue for Bayer, Monsanto, and Syngenta, these companies that are selling, yes, they're selling the seed varieties, but they're also selling all the chemicals that will be used on the seed varieties.
Yes. Yeah. I don't think there's any question about that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Again, just people don't always quite get it.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I've seen debates about, the science, some of the genetic modification might be good, but the massive amount of genetic modification is to be able so we can use more chemicals in our agriculture. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So does it make sense because of that to you that the USDA would in fact object to this initiative?
It certainly is consistent with what I've seen over the last 20 years or so in the kind of policy setting we've done to guide our commodity crop production. The policies have largely resulted in entrenching a small number of crops as the primary crops grown over a very, very large area, approximately 160 million acres worth of area for corn and soy. The policies have really encouraged and rewarded getting larger. So you have what were many small to mid-sized farms, now one large farm. It may have been 400 or 500 acre farms that are now 2,000 acre farm. You can have large swaths of the Midwest where a spray company will come through, spray the crop once, maybe come back and spray it twice, a second time, where that's done over large swaths of land to 1 or 2 crops, where in the past there may have been 5 crops in that same growing region. So things have been simplified greatly in my lifetime as a research and person looking at these things. All of that taken together then, policy, crop simplification, scale of farming getting so much larger, has resulted in, and this packaging that we spoke of, the packaging of traits, seed treatments, and then ready access to the herbicides that can be applied over large areas, that all of those factors have come together to result in something that we think of as lock-in or entrenchment of a certain way of agriculture that becomes difficult to break out of that way of agriculture. And so the private sector reinforces that state of agriculture. And it's difficult for the farmers that, that might have an interest in breaking out of that. The markets have broken down. The farming equipment is no longer on the farm to do vegetables or to do small grains or to do something else, to cut hay, etc. The animals are gone. The animals have been consolidated and concentrated in certain areas. So all of that decoupling then is something that I see that, our policy, the Farm Bill, the policy setting on genetically modified crops, the policy setting on the paired pesticides that go with the genetically modified crops. All of this is happening in a way that reinforces the current form of agriculture that predominates on the landscape. So does it surprise me that the USDA would recoil at the initiatives that are being undertaken in the EU? It doesn't surprise me.
You're painting a picture in which government policy doesn't just permit these things, it mandates them.
Yeah.
Because it creates an economic system that almost doesn't tolerate any alternative.
Yeah. It mandates it, and it mandates and enables it.
And enables it.
Yeah. Removes the hurdles that exist to try to keep this in check in some way, and it plays out in weird ways, Dave. I have a very vivid memory of how this plays out. We were down to the Environmental Protection Agency headquarters to present on this concern that we have, this critical juncture that 2010, 2011. The juncture was that we must, so what is the road not taken, right? The agroecological path, or are we going to take the path of a policy setting that enables the USDA to approve the GMO herbicide traits, and that the EPA will approve the pesticides that go along with those traits? All of a sudden now you're just like fueling this thing. The momentum is picking up. And I remember we drove down in our beat up Ford Taurus sedan university car, and there were three of us, kind of a ragtag couple, three of us, and we go in and give this talk, and they piped it across the country to the EPA labs and such. And then we stayed after for question and answer and docked and whatnot. And they said, okay, well, that's great. Thanks for coming down. That was really nice of you to come in and do that. And we've got another thing coming next, right after you guys. So we need to transition. And interestingly, the next group coming in was the Monsanto legal team. Literally, we crossed paths in the hallway. They were coming into the foyer, and we were going out. And it was 10 or 12 smartly dressed, all on the subject of this GM trait thing that we had just been talking with them about. And they were coming in to talk with the EPA officials about, how do we move along these registrations for these herbicides for the crop. This is the sort of the nature of how this is playing out in the decision-making space. It's political, and there are winners and there are losers, and there are companies involved, and there's private sector forces, that have interests of a certain kind to see this turn out a certain way. And so, And so it's important, I think, then. So what's the point of all of that? I think what's important is, I think it's very important for the public to understand the things that influence decisions. And it's important for there to be a countervailing force, which is groups of folks that are advocating for the public good, that know the issues as well as the legal teams know the issues for Bayer or Monsanto or, you know, these companies, because you know, that's I think that's where the action is happening. It's the enabling policy making. And once the policy making happens, and we've talked about this a lot, about the soil decision with organic, once the policy decisions are made, or feet are drug and the decision isn't made, but you let things happen anyway, it's very hard to get back to the juncture, right? Like once you've started traveling that path, it's hard to get folks to consider backtracking. And you know, as I've been in this for a longer and longer period of time, I think that's something that I just find that's a sobering reality. And therefore, when we do get to these junctures, it's all the more important for us to, you know, do everything we can to make the kind of decisions that are going to serve the public well and serve the environment well going forward.
All right. Well, let's cross that bridge. We're there.
Thank you for listening to the Real Organic Podcast. Please subscribe today and share the link with your friends. And if you're willing to leave us a rating and a review, it helps others find this podcast episode. A video version of this interview is also found at realorganicproject.org and on our YouTube channel. If you join us next time, we'll continue our conversation with Dr. Dave Mortensen, the chair of the Department of Agriculture, Nutrition, and Food Systems at the University of New Hampshire, and former National Organic Standards Board member, where he was a member of the Soil 7. See you next time.